Before we get started today, I'd like to extend our sincere appreciation to our sponsors who share our commitment to catalyzing and sustaining the work of building a more equitable society. Their support and investment allows us to keep this conference free and open to the public, not only locally, but across the U.S. and globally, so that thousands of participants in dozens of countries can benefit from these resources. Our visionary sponsor is Reinsurance Group of America. Our advocate sponsors are Christian Johnson, Nestle Purina, R&L, Schnucks, Spire, UMB Financial. Our ally sponsors are Armstrong Teasdale, Brown & Crouppen, CBiz, Cigna, Delta Dental, the Jane M. and Bruce P. Robert Charitable Foundation, St. Louis Community Foundation, the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis, Sumit Verma and Nisha Dharma. Our print media sponsor is the St. Louis American, and our radio media sponsor is St. Louis Public Radio. This conference would not be possible without our presenters, moderators, and panelists. They have our appreciation and esteem for giving so generously of their expertise and time to join us. We also extend gratitude to the many Webster staff and faculty members who have worked collaboratively to bring this conference to fruition. And now, I'd like to introduce Michelle King. Michelle is the Vice President of Talent Acquisition and Diversity and Inclusion for Reinsurance Group of America, the visionary sponsor of the conference. Michelle?
Good morning. Well, it is a pleasure for us to be here today and actually welcome you to this conference. RGA has actually partnered with Webster University for this conference for many years because we actually have a shared belief that when we are talking together, when we're actually coming and having conversations, and we listen and we celebrate both what we have in common and our differences, we become wiser and more inclusive, and we're better together for that. At RGA, we believe that. We actually strive to ensure that all of our employees work together to listen, to understand each other's experiences, their backgrounds, their beliefs, and coming together that we together are better. We believe it's everyone's responsibility. We all have that responsibility to promote a culture that prioritizes diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we actually listen to one another, that when we come together and do that, we can be better about that. And that's why this conference is invaluable to you. We believe that change can happen. It isn't easy all the time. However, it is within our reach, and we do believe it's possible, both where we're at, within our organizations, and in our communities. It takes a village, and it takes change agents, and that's what we believe you are today. We encourage you to do that, to actually take in what you're learning today, to explore, to listen, to take note, and take those building blocks back to where you're at work, in your lives, in your community, to do so. It's my pleasure to actually introduce our first speaker today. She's actually speaking to us regarding the scope of wrongful incarcerations, the disparity of injustice of those who can't have access, of women who are incarcerated. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Geraghty-Rathert, Professor of Department of Law, Crime, and Social Justice. Thanks so much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in and for showing up at this early hour of the day. I'm sure you have a million things to do, but this is a really important conference, a really great conference, and worth your time. So maybe not my presentation, but a lot of it is definitely worth your time. So thanks for being here. I wanted to just sort of jump in with my discussion so that I can get to a strange tangent, which is what happened yesterday in my life. So I represent clients who are incarcerated, all in women's prisons. And yesterday I had a parole hearing with one of them, and it was a strange situation. We won't know the outcome for 3 weeks, so I'll take away that little bit of suspense. But I want to talk about that as much as I can. So I'm going to start right away. Again, my name is Geraghty-Rathert, and I am a lawyer and also a professor at Webster. I teach legal studies and I teach women, gender, and sexuality studies. And I am entering my 30th year at Webster, which is sad and frightening, but good because it's a good place to be, but that's a really long time. Gives me pause. But I have always, through my legal career, represented people in situations of domestic violence. And up until about 10 years ago, I did primarily divorces for free through legal services and other organizations for people in situations of family violence, and orders of protection as well. But about 10 years ago, I was approached with a client who was a survivor of horrific violence herself from her family, but who was incarcerated directly because of the violence perpetrated against her. So I didn't want to actually look into it. I didn't do any criminal law, and it wasn't my area. Certainly, I'm not even an expert now, 10 years later. But once I read the case and once I figured out what was going on, I was taken in, and since that time I've taken on not only her case, but the case of other people as well, all women incarcerated in women's prisons. So later, after I got a few clients, some student interns and I formulated what is now known as the WILLOW Project. So let me take you through some of this. I'm going to strangely jump through some of the slides. Hopefully that won't distract you, but because I'm trying to get fairly quickly to the parole hearing discussion. So the first, if I can make it work. The first thing I should say is what the title of this talk is today, and it's called Slipping Through the Cracks or Free-Falling Through the Gaps. And I think that describes sort of my experience with working in the criminal justice system. I guess as a privileged person, I wanted to believe what I had always been told, that of course, the U.S. justice system is the best in the world. And maybe that is true in some ways, but just because it's the best doesn't mean it doesn't need also to be better and to be reformed. But I also think that we grossly underestimate the impact on people who are in marginalized groups, especially the impoverished, but also people in groups that have historically been discriminated against. Women, people of color, people with disabilities, the list goes on, and I'm sure I'll discuss it till the cows come home for you today. So just briefly, my clients are all wrongfully convicted and wrongfully incarcerated. The actual definition of that for most of the law world, when you say wrongfully convicted, most people take that as being factually innocent. And in fact, at this moment, the clients that I have are factually innocent. But through the years, my definition of wrongful conviction has grown substantially to include not only wrongful conviction, but also wrongful incarceration, to include people who are over-policed in their communities, overcharged with crimes, over-sentenced, and have worse outcomes than people who can afford their own full-time criminal defense lawyer. So what's the scope of the wrongful conviction problem? In terms of the groups that are being studied, those are almost all factually innocent groups. So among them, the Innocence Project, DNA exonerations to date of 375 people. The National Registry of Exonerations, both DNA and non-DNA exonerations, 2,984 to date. Also another group, the Death Penalty Information Center, estimates that at least 18 people have received the death penalty in the United States who were later shown to be factually innocent. And so, it's a big problem. And then, as I said, how it impacts different groups, plays out in a lot of different ways. So what I am focused on primarily in the clients that I take is people who are incarcerated in women's prisons. So although the female state prison population is much lower, substantially lower than the male prison population, the growth rate of both is large, but the growth of people in women's prisons is at least twice, and if not 3 times as much as the growth of people in men's prisons. So between 1978 and 2015, the state prison population across the United States grew by 834%. And of those people who are in prison, 80% of people in women's prison are parents. And of those parents, 60% are parents of children under the age of 18. And in women's prisons in particular, over 90% of those groups of people that have children are either single parents or the primary child caretaker of the children under the age of 18. So when they are incarcerated, this is not just an issue for that person, right? It's an issue for their family, it's an issue for their children, it's an issue for the community and for society as a whole, obviously. So a couple of issues associated with that. Since there are fewer women in women's prisons than there are men in men's prisons and other people, there are fewer women's prisons. So for instance, in the state of Missouri, we have about 12 or 13 men's prisons and only 2 women's prisons. The 2 women's prisons are on opposite sides of the state. So there's one on this side near St. Louis, Vandalia, which is about an hour from here. And then there's one about an hour from Kansas City in Chillicothe, Missouri. And so one of the issues is that if someone is convicted and they are going to be sent to a woman's prison, they are going to try to send them to the one that's closest, but that's often miles and miles away from their family and friends. And so, you can figure out what the difficulties there are, because a lot of these people are extremely low income. This is essentially cutting them off from their family members and the ability to visit, because no one can travel that far and then, say, take a hotel room, pay for the food that they need when they get there. That's cost prohibitive. And so a lot of people end up not seeing their children and family members for years and years. So again, impacting them and the children and, of course, the community. So one other issue, going back to the issue of DNA and wrongful convictions, one of the issues that also faces people in women's prisons is that women are less likely to be convicted of crimes for which there is DNA. And so that means like the most violent crimes, rape and murder, and the DNA that those inevitably leave behind, women are less likely to be convicted of those crimes. And that means then that it's much more difficult, if not impossible, to prove one's innocence after they have been wrongfully convicted and exhausted all appeals. So of all those people that we've been talking about that have been exonerated, in other words, declared factually innocent in a court of law, only 13 of the women were exonerated based on DNA evidence, and only 9% of the total number of people exonerated for wrongful convictions, both DNA and non-DNA, are people who are housed in women's prisons. So again, that does reflect a very substantial difference in the populations, but not nearly to the extent that only 9% are people in women's prisons. So this is the project that I formed along with student interns and volunteers and wonderful people who have helped me through the last 10 years, some of whom have stuck with me and refused to leave, my favorites. And so together we formulated a project called the WILLOW Project. And actually WILLOW is an acronym. It stands for Women Initiate Legal Lifelines to Other Women. Now that was 10 years ago. I was a lot more binary then. I guess I need to step up my game and rewrite the mission statement, so I won't read it out loud to you. But clearly I have evolved as well. So anyway, what do we do? What do my students do? What does our project do? Right now we're representing 3 women. I'm going to talk to you about their cases in just a moment. But for instance, the legal studies students help me with the legal issues involved in it, research and writing, but also like making phone calls, setting up prison visits, corresponding with the clients, talking to the clients on the phone, all of those kinds of things underneath my supervision as is appropriate and required. But I have a lot of other students who work with me as well from other places in the university. I have had several students from human rights and humanitarian studies who have done a variety of things. I've had people from communications doing PR and social media campaigns for us. So a wide variety of people, and not only people getting credit as interns, but also people just volunteering on like a project by project basis just because they wanted to be involved. And so, I think that's a really important facet of these kinds of things. If you're interested in social justice work, it's sometimes difficult to find full-time jobs in these kinds of places, and certainly jobs that pay your student loans back and all those other things like, eating and rent and things that we like to do. But if you have the capacity, you can incorporate it into your regular life and your regular job. And that's not possible for everybody, but it is possible for some people. So I'll talk more about that as we go along. And sort of, I'm going on a lot of tangents, as I always do. That's what happens when you're diagnosed with ADHD, so just roll with me. But one of the things that happened through the years is that, sometimes very sad and depressing things would happen in the representation of these clients. And if I had students who were working very closely with me, it would sometimes feel overwhelming to them. And so one of the things that we started to do was have short-term projects within the long-term projects. So we set up a food pantry on campus first, to meet needs of students who have student food scarcity. And at that time, the estimate across the country was 30%. Since the pandemic, they're saying that college students, almost 80% of students in college since the pandemic will face food scarcity issues if they have not already. So we have a food pantry that we maintain. We also have some other short-term projects, drives of various kinds, clothing drives and food drives. And we had one of our student interns suddenly became homeless. She had 3 small children. So we decided that we were going to fix that. And we did all the legal research to get her a subsidized place to live with her children and to get her dishes and mattresses and all the things that she would need. So those short-term projects have sort of sustained us and made us capable of doing this work, in the long term. So let's get to the current clients of the WILLOW Project. My first client, and the client that I took on 10 years ago, who sadly is still in prison today, is named Angel. Angel is now a 48-year-old person. She went into the prison system when she was 19. So she's been in prison now for 29 years, essentially the same amount of time I've been at Webster. So that when I compare her life during that time period to mine, I realize how privileged I really am. So Angel is a person who has very serious developmental disabilities. She has the mental age of about a 10-year-old person, as she did at the time she was convicted. So after a childhood of horrific abuse by her family, primarily by her father, she left home at the age of 12 and was out on the street. Obviously didn't have a high school education at the age of 12, but also couldn't read or write because of some of her delays. So it wasn't, she tried to get a job by lying about her age in the fast food industry. It didn't work out. So fairly quickly, she found herself working as a prostitute. She found a person to work with, a pimp, Stephen, and then along with another young female worked with them. She had a child at the age of 17 and a child at the age of 18, both of whom she sort of gave to her own mother, who had left her abusive father by then. So her mother was essentially raising her 2 children. At some point, Stephen said to Angel and the other young woman, whose name incidentally was also Angel, strangely, some strange prophetic divinity or something, I don't know. But I'll refer to her as AC just to clarify who I'm talking about. So my client as Angel and the other person as AC, told them that if they went and met this guy, he would get them better paying clients, higher level clients. And so they went, but it turned out it was something of a trap, I suppose, and she was held against her will in what we would now call the sex trafficking industry, forced to engage in horrific sexual acts with a variety of clients that they brought in, obviously unpaid, not, and so not even in the situation where she was before. At some point, her mother, who was taking care of her children, started to look for her because Angel would stop by and see her periodically. So her mother's like, well, where is Angel? So her mother started putting, the word out in the local community in the neighborhood, and someone told her that they believed she was staying at the house of this person, Garland Schaefer, which was correct. So she started to strategize how she was going to get in to see her. Garland and Stephen found out this was going on, so they went to threaten her. They put all four of them in the car, Angel, AC, Stephen, and Garland went over to the house of the mother, threatened the mother, and kidnapped the 1-year-old child. The 2-year-old was fortunately with another relative at that moment. So they kidnapped the 1-year-old child and said they were going to kill the baby if the mother said anything to anyone. However, 2 elderly women in the community heard about the story, and so they started to put feelers out, calling the police and so forth. So a couple days later, the 4 of them again got in the car, this time with the baby, went over and kidnapped the 2 elderly women and took them back to this house where they were all being held against their will. And they threatened them, they beat them severely, and eventually killed one of the elderly women. Garland Schaefer strangled her and killed her in front of all of them. And then the other woman, they were going to kill her as well, but said if she could get them money, they might save her life. So they all got in a car. She said, I have relatives in Missouri. This was all happening in Iowa. I should have mentioned that. I have relatives in Missouri who have money. So if we go to Missouri, I can get you money. So they traveled across state lines, but by then the police were onto them and were following them. So Stephen and Garland dragged this older woman into the woods and beat her to death with a 2x4. Then they all holed up in a motel like a bad old movie. The police surrounded the hotel and said, come out with your hands up. And later, one of the police officers said, this is when I first suspected that Angel and AC were perhaps not guilty parties, because in all my years of being a police officer, nobody ever came running out when we said, come out with your hands up, right? So essentially Angel and AC grabbed the baby and ran out the front door, went to the police car, leapt into the police car, and locked the door behind them. And again, the police officer said, this suggested to me that whatever was happening in that hotel was way worse than whatever the police were going to come up with. But so he believed she was, they were innocent victims, as they were. But he took them to Walmart in the local community, got them diapers and some food from the baby, who had only had alcohol for 2 days at that point. And then by the time they got to the police station, the 2 men had implicated Angel and AC as the masterminds of this sex trafficking ring. Now, mind you, Garland was at that time 62, and Stephen was 36, and Angel was 19, and AC was 16. So who the real masterminds were, I will leave it up to you. But the younger woman was immediately taken into juvenile custody, and after 2 years she was out. She's lived an amazing, seemingly normal, stellar life. Hard to believe after that experience. But Angel went into the adult prison system because she was 19. Because of her disabilities, she could not tell the police what happened with any kind of, accuracy. And so they arrested her and charged her, along with the 2 men, with first-degree murder and kidnapping in both the state of Iowa and in the state of Missouri. Threatened with the death penalty in Missouri, she took a plea to life in prison in Missouri and a plea to life in prison without the possibility of parole in Iowa, to run concurrently, sorry. So I got her case and went to meet her. Within, I swear, 10 minutes of knowing her, I could see the issues that she faced. If I had said the sky is bright orange, she would have said, yeah, it really is. Yeah. Basically, whatever you said, she was going to agree with. She didn't have the capacity to contradict that, and that's how she ended up to be convicted. In fact, she only met her public defender for 1/2 of an hour before, at the age of 19, taking pleas in both the state of Missouri and Iowa to life in prison. So, that's the longer story. She's been in prison, as I said, for 29 years. She's no longer under the Missouri system. She's been housed in Iowa the whole time. We were able to get her parole in Missouri, but now we're trying to get her out in Iowa, and that is a much tougher battle because she has life without parole as opposed to life with parole. So that is the case of Angel, my first client. So going forward from that, the next client was Amelia, and she's the one I had the parole hearing for yesterday, so I'll talk a little bit more about her in just a minute. But she was 16 at the time of the crime, and she had a lifetime of physical and sexual abuse from her family members. Her parents, in particular, her father, her brother, and her cousin had sexually abused her throughout her childhood. And you know how, and this was my argument yesterday, which seemed to fall to some extent on deaf ears. I think that most people recognize now, or at least they've heard of, what used to be called battered woman or battered spouse syndrome, and is now referred to as battered intimate partner defense. When someone who is in a situation of horrific domestic violence with an intimate partner kills that person because they can't find any other way out of the situation in which they are. And I think we all have some understanding of that, our acceptance of it more or less perhaps. But there is no such similar thing for a child. And so Amelia was being abused in every possible way, and she couldn't get out of the situation. But you know how we always say, well, why didn't you tell somebody? Why didn't you leave? Totally inappropriate questions to ask anyone in a situation of violence. We should be asking the perpetrators, why are you causing harm? Not asking a victim who's trying to survive why they're doing what they're doing. But in this particular case, Amelia did all of that. She told teachers. She told counselors. She told social workers what was happening to her. She checked herself into a mental health facility at the age of 14 and told everybody there about the abuse that she was suffering. And what did they do? They kept her for about 3 months, gave her some medication for her anxiety, met with the family, said, don't do that anymore, and sent her back. So at the age of 16, she became addicted to drugs. She was dating much older men. And one of her ex-boyfriends, a person named Chad Brantley, who was, I think, she was 16. I think he was 29. No, 26. I guess it says it there. So 10 years older than her. She was saying she hated her parents. She wished they were dead, like a lot of 16-year-olds say. And he said, well, I want to get back together with you. She said she wasn't interested. So in an effort to win her back, he entered her house and shot both of her parents, killing her mother and badly injuring her father, who did not die. She called 911. The paramedics came, took her father away. The police arrived at that time and spoke to her at the age of 16 without any adults present. And so by the time she got to the police station, they were accusing her of first-degree murder as well, along with her ex-boyfriend. So she was threatened with the death penalty, as Angel was. However, this was post-Roper v. Simmons, the case that outlawed the death penalty for juveniles. However, the police can say in the United States to a person, and it's not unethical, it's not inappropriate, they can lie in any way to a suspect within the law. Totally permissible. So they told her she would get the death penalty if she didn't, essentially confess. And so out of fear that she would be executed, she took a plea bargain at the age of 16 to 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole in reality, but to run end to end, to run consecutively. What kind of plea bargain that is, I don't know. You can't get a worse sentence than that I mean, she thought she could get the death penalty, which is why she took it, but she couldn't. There is no worse sentence than 2 life sentences running end to end. So that means that she wouldn't be parole eligible for 60 years. So I'll come back to that. She's now 32, so she's been in prison as long as she was ever out of prison. Amanda BUSSE, the third client, I better pick up the pace, was also a victim survivor of horrific family violence. In Amanda's case, she never was allowed to leave her home. So she never went to school. She never went anywhere. She was physically and sexually abused by a whole ring of drug clients of her father in Crawford County, Missouri. So her father was like the meth drug kingpin of Crawford County, Missouri, and he had a whole ring of people, and she was sexually abused by all of them. All of these cases are horrific. I won't go into the violence, but if you can imagine this. At the age of 17, her father decided he was tired of her, so he sold her to one of the drug clients who was 36 at the time, told her that he was now her husband, right? So that they were married. That was never actually factually true. But of course, she had never been outside. She had never gone to school, had no education, didn't know anything. So she believed it was true. She thought you could just say you're married and you were married. So she went to live with this person, also feared within the community, also incredibly violent drug lord. Not long after that, a woman in the local community who lived in a group home was murdered, brutally murdered. And her husband and father-in-law were accused of the crime. Her father-in-law was dismissed from the case for whatever reason. Her husband, and I'm using the term only because she uses it, obviously I wouldn't call this horrifying perpetrator anybody's spouse, but she does. She still refers to him as her husband. He was found guilty and went to prison. So she was almost 18 at that time. So she had lived with him for about a year at that point. And had one child with him, by the way, in that time period. So he went to prison, so she started to try to get her life together and leaving her house for the first time. But 6 years after that, no one ever implicated her in the crime of the murder of this woman in any way. No one mentioned her name. A lot of people didn't even know she existed. But her younger brother, who was 11 at the time of the murder, was sexually abusing her nieces. And so she thought, I'm not going to allow this to happen to my nieces, to another generation. So she went to the police and told them. They charged him with sex crimes against these children, and he told them that if they would let him, he would tell them who the real perpetrators were in exchange for a plea bargain in which he wouldn't serve any time in prison. So because he was angry at her for turning him in, he implicated his sister, and she was accused of the murder of this person from 6 years before. There was no evidence against her, never was, except the word of this person who was, at the time, 11 years old. Nobody said he was there either. So it was a strange set of facts. She refused to take the plea bargain because she was factually innocent, wasn't even there, didn't even know what had happened, wasn't even sure if her husband or her father-in-law was involved in the crime. But she was convicted by a jury in 2 hours and given 25 years to life for the murder of this person. And she, at that point, because she had started getting her life together, she had a new boyfriend, and she had just had a baby at the time that she was accused of the crime. So when she was convicted, her child was 6 months old. And they said, well, we're going to give your child to some family members. And she's like, hell no. So she put her child up for adoption at 6 months of age because she was entering the prison system. And fortunately, that child ended up going to a very lovely family who lives in Florida. At the age of, when the child turned 10, they let her begin to correspond with Amanda in prison, and they now have a very good relationship. And the child's now 18 years old, or 19 almost. But that is the story of Amanda in prison for 25 years for a crime at which she was not even present. So going forward, what outcomes do we seek? Anything basically that would get them out of prison, whatever it would take the least amount of time. In a perfect world, we would seek exoneration, which would mean that they were declared factually innocent. That's a long shot, right? Exonerations are hard to come by. So what will we take? Anything else. clemency, which would be a pardon by the governor, also almost impossible in Missouri historically. Commutation, which would be logically a parole board act where they would shorten the person's sentence, or in some states, commutation and parole are so similar to each other that they almost don't differ. Of course, parole, you're probably familiar with allowing someone out of prison before the end of their sentence on the promise of good behavior. So, as I said, yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. I went to a parole board hearing on the other side of the state in Chillicothe, Missouri for Amelia. So you might say, how did she get a parole board hearing? Well, it's because of great lawyering and advocacy throughout the United States. So, in 2004, the Supreme Court of the United States said you can't execute juveniles. In 2012, they said you can't give life without parole sentences to people who are juveniles at the time of the crime. Unfortunately, that did not apply to Amelia because her sentences were life with the possibility of parole. However, there were two of them set to run end to end. And so what we say in the law, a de facto life sentence, so without parole. So in fact, she had parole, but that was never going to happen because once the 30 years presumed of the first life sentence would end, then the next 30 years would begin. So 60 years until she could be eligible for a parole hearing. But because of, as I said, great advocacy and people working in psychology on the brain of juveniles, people breaking down what the situation is, there finally a case in the last 2 years came out of the state of Colorado in which someone had almost the identical facts. A male who had 2 consecutive sentences from the age of 16, and the Colorado Supreme Court said that is essentially a life sentence without parole. It's per se, inappropriate. It hasn't gone to the United States Supreme Court yet. We'll see what happens if it does. But the point of this is all the states are sort of scrambling because they don't want to look like the bad guys. That's a beautiful thing. Shaming people is a wonderful strategy. And so Missouri, we kept sending them memos and updating them with the case law, the parole board this is. And so finally, out of the blue, like a month ago, they didn't contact me. That's a whole other set of circumstances. They never contact me. I'm the invisible lawyer. They contacted her a month ago and said, you have a parole hearing on March the 1st, just out of the blue. So hooray, a parole hearing when none was expected for 60 years. So we strategize and strategize. I have a really great student intern, fortunately, right now, Sky Krakos. I'll just give a shout out to them. Sky has been doing incredible, amazing work, making phone calls, getting letters, and putting together the parole brief from our clemency brief, and just doing amazing work. Human rights and humanitarian studies student. And so I went yesterday. And, where to start on this experience? I've been to prison many times. I've been to several parole hearings, actually. But this one stands alone for the strangeness of it. So part of that was that two of the parole hearing board is always 3 people. So one person who's on the parole board of the state, and then 2 other hearing officers, the 3 of them together making the decision based on what comes out of that conversation. And largely they're just talking to the person who's incarcerated, Amelia. But then I'm allowed to make a statement at the end, right, as her advocate or the delegate, as they were calling me, her delegate. So 2 of the people were on Zoom from Jeff City, and 1 was in the room with us. The 2 people from Jeff City were pretty standard. I've never seen 2 more bored people in my life. They were like, so what happened? But okay, that's, they do a lot of parole hearings. I guess I can forgive them that. But the person who was in the room with us was incredibly hostile toward Amelia and was making like snorting sounds and all these things, no matter what she would answer, to the point where then Amelia started to get teary-eyed and confused, and it was hard to speak. And I'm not really supposed to speak. I can get thrown out of the hearing, which I didn't want to do, but I said I just have to, object or whatever the equivalent of that is, and say that the sounds and the faces you're making at my client are not helpful, and I need you to stop that right now, or I'm going to file a lawsuit against the parole board. So total silence then. But the danger of that is she's the one who's in the prison. And so Amelia is the one who's going to get the backlash, not me. Nobody's going to call me up and start harassing me. So it's a dangerous, line to walk. You don't want to make people who are going to be with your client all day, every day mad. And you don't want to make the parole board mad, lest they act out toward you as the lawyer instead of weighing the merits of the case. But so it finally got to the end, and one person was essentially asking the questions, and Amelia held up really well, telling her story, sticking to her story, even when they were kind of being a little sarcastic with her. But finally, this woman who was in the room with us, just out of the blue, she says, "Well, I don't understand this, Amelia. Why the hell didn't you just leave?" And then I could feel the blood begin to rush into my head, into my face. So again, when you're talking about people who are in situations of violence, it's not the person who stays that should be questioned. It's the perpetrator that needs to be questioned. And of course, people stay because that's the safest thing for them to do. Only they can assess what is in their best interests, and they make those choices. But adding into that, she was a child, 16 years old, told everybody she could tell, tried everything to get out of the situation. You shouldn't expect that of anyone, but if you're going to expect it of someone, she happened to have done it, right? And still was sent back. And she, Amelia was saying, had just said, I really didn't, yes, I did say I wanted my parents to be dead, but I didn't say to Chad, go kill them. I was just, I wish they were dead. And they're like, well, do you still wish they're dead? And so this woman keeps going on and on. She's like, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you run away with your boyfriend? Why didn't you do this? Like on and on and on. So finally I'm like, okay, no, we are done now. We are done with this conversation. No one else is going to ask my client why she didn't leave when she was 16 years old. And again, they're all like looking at me like, oh, the mean lawyer, right? That's what happens when lawyers are in the equation. But Amelia's crying and unable to speak. So all of this to say, it did not end on the best note. She did a great job. I'm not sure that I did the best job. Strategically, I've been thinking of nothing else since I was awake all night thinking about it. Strategically, I don't think it was the worst thing because at least she was playing the gender role they wanted her to play, the sad, crying, regretful person. And then I was the big mean lawyer, which is also, the stereotype that they could accept. But the gendered conversation that went on during this parole hearing is one for the record book. And I intend to write down every single question as I remember them. Because everything was about, what she would do in the future and, what skills she had, which were, have you ever worked in the laundry at the prison? Have you ever cooked food at the prison? And I'm like, there are a lot of things going on at the prison, people working in mechanical roles as well, but okay. So all of this to say, it wasn't the best day, and perhaps as a lawyer, not my finest hour, but we wait. So in 3 weeks, we're supposed to get an answer, and until then, there isn't much that we can do. I am continuing to send whatever information I have. So if anyone is interested in writing a letter on Amelia's behalf, it would have to be in the next 48 hours, but you could send me an email and say, I support, dear parole board, I support the release of Amelia Christine Bird from prison, a person who at the age of 16 was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and has now served 16 years, or whatever you want to put in it. So, okay, into this depressing conversation, then I have to insert the reason why I'm supposed to be here, which is what do we do as people who are wanting to change the system or wanting to change society to make it more fair, more just, more inclusive, to not discriminate against people who can't afford attorneys and who are, in marginalized or oppressed groups. And I think that the answer to that is, as I said briefly before, to volunteer, or if you're a student, you could do an internship for credit. Then you can fit it into your life a little bit. But I know a lot of attorneys who work their full-time day job and then on the side do their gig. Another Webster graduate represents only women who killed their batterers and has been wildly successful in getting people out of prison, has gotten more women out of prison who killed their batterers than anyone else in the history of the United States. And so, working with a project that speaks to you in whatever way, volunteering in the short run, in the long run, figuring out what your skills are, and then relentlessly pursuing that organization to get them to respond, because I assure you they all want your help, they need your help, and they don't have time to answer you. So if you say, this is what I can do, these are the things I'm good at, this is my time frame that I'm available, how do I help? I assure you that they will find something for you to do. And so I think that is the best advice I have in terms of getting involved, but I would love to hear what you all have to say. Yeah, I think I went past the questions and answers, so I think we're good. I would love to hear your questions or your thoughts or comments about any of this, and maybe your suggestions about how this translates best into making our criminal justice system, which shows all its flaws when you get into these situations. How do we make that work better for everyone? And so I thank you again for letting me be here and the honor of speaking at this important conference. So, what questions do you have, if any?
I have a question. There we go. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't one of the big problems the fact that the minute somebody is paroled or exonerated, then there's this system that kicks into place that whoever was involved in the wrongful conviction, all their cases are brought back out for review, and then the whole system is put under attack. So at least my general understanding is it's not just the individual that's the problem. There's this bias towards, well, you have to understand, we can't open up all these other cases and things. Is that accurate? Is that part of the problem? Do you want me to show my preference? I wish they would all be reopened if there was evidence that someone actually did something willfully incorrectly. But that is actually very infrequent, but I think it's the fear. I think the people who are involved in these individual cases are all, when I contact them, some of them are very humble and will say, if what you're saying is correct, then I hope it works out. This is what I did and this was my participation. But most of them push back, and they push back hard. And I think I think that's a very human thing to do. You don't want to be part of what went wrong. You don't want to be the reason someone has wrongfully spent decades in prison, and so you can't, your mind can't let you do that. So you say, no, that person is guilty, despite any evidence to the contrary. There are a lot of DNA cases in which, people who participated in the wrongful convictions are like, no, well, that's just wrong. The DNA was tested wrong or something went wrong. So I think that denial is real. But I think you are bringing up an important issue, which is the implications systemically and what the ramifications of making some of these changes might be. And so, yeah, like there was a case in which a DNA crime lab, actually run by the FBI, had a person who was in charge of it for 5 years who was an alcoholic, unfortunately, and she didn't do any DNA testing for 5 years. She just filled out the forms and would check yes or no for the matches. And so they did have to reopen all her cases, but they didn't ever contact the defendants who are in prison who might have been wrongfully convicted, nor their lawyers. And to this day, that's an issue. The FBI, that's been 10 years ago, and still they haven't been contacted. Right, because it seems like we have the reverse action. When you go into trial, you're innocent until proven guilty. And some of these cases, I would think you could throw out automatically 30 minutes of consultation before a life sentence is imposed. But now in the parole system, it's almost like you're guilty until you can prove you're innocent, and they can almost use any kind of tactic or lie or whatever. So
I see that the structure has to be so revised. It's just,
Yes, you're absolutely right on both sides, right? One of the biggest problems on the front end is the lack of resources for the public defense system in the United States. And public defenders, of course, are the attorneys that are appointed for people who can't afford them. So when you watch all these crime shows and they say, if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you. Yes, that's true. But you better hope it's not in Missouri, which is ranked 50th of the public defender
I was just going to say that they're atrocious.
Right, and it's not that they're not good lawyers. I know some of the most noble people in the world who are public defenders in the state of Missouri. It's that in Missouri, we don't want to fund the lawyers who might represent criminals. They're the easiest to disregard. So no money for investigation, very few lawyers, lower pay than the prosecutors get, and a lifetime of being shamed. They're like, you represent, people always say, you represent those horrible people? Why, yes, I do, because the Constitution says that they need representation, and there are situations in which people are, falling into the gaps. So that's the front end. The parole board, as you suggest, though, is exactly the same. There is no evidentiary standard when you're post-conviction.
And then the fact that when you start advocating for the person, then it's like you're put on trial. It's almost like you're risking.
Right.
You can't even. It's almost like you have handcuffs on you while you're trying to advocate for the person.
And when I first started my statement at the end, I started talking about her lifetime of violence, which she never got to tell anyone because, of course, she took a plea bargain. So this was like the first time she said it out loud, and I was, reiterating it. And one of the parole board members said, you're really supposed to just only talk about what her future might hold and what you see. And I said, that is not what the statute says.
And there again, to start limiting people, that legalism, you can only talk about this, or you can only bring up that, or you have to follow this procedure. So I just wanted to conclude by saying thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Well, yes, would that it were more successful. But thank you. Yeah. Other questions?
Are there any legislative initiatives on the front end, reforms around protecting juveniles, the conditions under which they could accept a plea bargain, things like that we could get behind?
I think there are a lot of small efforts. What we honestly need is within each state a compelling effort by people who are concerned. And unfortunately, that's not my area. But, if legislators and you can get them interested in this topic, there's a lot of cases in a lot of states now that are suggesting that, and psychological testing that suggests the brain isn't fully developed till perhaps the age of 25 even. And so juveniles are extremely susceptible to the types of coercion and manipulation that occur in interrogation processes. And so juveniles are the most likely to be convicted and to wrongfully confess to crimes they did not commit, whether through plea bargains or through actual confessions, because they are, malleable and, and the lies that they're told, which are, again, lawful for the police, another area that needs dramatic reform that other countries don't have. Some countries, the police can't lie. They have a specific script. They can't deviate from the script. It's videotaped so that if anybody has any questions, but ours is just a void. There's no transparency. They can lie. They can manipulate. They can say, you've seen the good cop, bad cop thing. That is perfectly legitimate and in fact is taught as a technique in policing. So juveniles are really vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. And, so what we need is any of you who are listening who are good at those sorts of legislative things to take these initiatives or to speak to someone who will, a legislator or whomever. So an excellent question. I wish I wish that was my area, but it's not. But if it's yours, we can talk. So.
Thank you.
So I had one question, and then I also had a comment. So you just casually mentioned writing the letter. That's something that I would be interested in. I'm sure there's other folks. Is there a way to post an email address so that we can take advantage of that?
Yes. So, I'm obviously on Webster's
I found
site.
it, but I wanted to make sure everybody else.
Yeah. So the end of it is at webster.edu. So you all know that part, right? So it's just A. Rathert, ARATHERT. And yes, I can post it wherever you like. I can, put it on, the Law, Crime, and Social Justice webpage or whatever too. But it's just Rathert at webster.edu, Rathert. So I would love it if any of you had the time to send a letter.
I've sent you an email already.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So this is such an important topic, and I was just interested to hear your perspective on the intersectionality of race that comes into play in these situations as well, because we've already talked about gender and age.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of studies about, and most of my research is in women's prisons, but a grossly disproportionate number of women of color are in women's prisons as opposed to white European American women. And, a lot of that is due to some of the same kinds of biases, but also to over-policing of communities of color, overcharging, over-suspicion, all of those same things, but also these sort of gendered expectations about motherhood specifically often lead to a lot of people. And there's a whole body of studies about how women of color are held to much higher standards in terms of their very gendered expectations of what it means to be a good mother. And so to the extent that someone fails to meet this impossible and unfair and targeting standard, they are charged with crimes that perhaps didn't even happen when children are harmed. Or, the other thing that impacts this, of course, is poverty. And a lot of people who are, people of color are living in communities that are relatively low income. And so not only do we have over-policing, but we also have childcare issues in these communities. So people who are working outside the home don't have the funds, as we saw during the pandemic for everybody, to afford quality childcare. And so when children are harmed, or that's neglect. But who's more likely to be charged with that? The white European American woman in Ladue, or a person of color who's being held to a standard that is far different than the standard of other people, and perhaps doesn't have the resources to afford an attorney of their own as well. So, I mean, we could go on that subject. But when you walk into the women's prisons, you see it. It's the first thing that gets your attention, the number of women of color as compared to the number of women who are white. It's dramatic. Other questions, comments, thoughts? We have just a few minutes left. Anything at all? Any questions on the webpage? No. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here and listening to me wax on about my most passionate and favorite subject. But I think the takeaway, if there is one, is that organizations need your help in whatever way you can give it. I understand that people can't commit to long periods of time, but short windows of time and specific skills and reaching out and being patient for the response, those are all critical things in working to achieve a more equitable world, right? So thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Hope the conference goes as well today as it apparently did yesterday. I'm sorry I missed it, but I was, in Chillicothe, so thanks.
Thank you so much again, Anne, for sharing your dedication to the WILLOW Project and to helping those who are marginalized in the prison system. We'll be back in 30 minutes for our next session. Thank you.